Genshin's 4.6 patch brings the highly anticipated Arlecchino, as well as reruns for Lyney, Wanderer, and Baizhu. And while some people know exactly who they want to get, a lot of people are having trouble deciding. That's why in this video we'll go over Arlecchino, Lyney, Wanderer, and Baizhu's strengths, weaknesses, team viability, and overall value. That way you'll know if one of these 5 stars is worth your primogems. After I do a brief overview of each character, I'll tell you who is the best value for you and give you a proven strategy that will help you get the characters you really want in the future. Each of the 5 stars on this list will receive a grading from bad to great in several categories, including personal damage, support capability, team flexibility, and free-to-play friendliness. I'll also recommend characters that would make good teammates for these 5 stars, since you often need specific characters to really unlock the power of a limited 5 star. But as always, if you know who you want already, then just wish for them. This is a guide to help clarify what the patch 4.6 limited 5 stars can do well and what they struggle with. That way you'll be prepared to solve any problems that arise as you play them. And just know that Arlecchino is a new 5-star character, so we'll still need to test her out fully to understand exactly how good she is, but based on the information we have, we can still give her a proper evaluation. With that said, make sure to like this video to receive the blessing of Shark Luck, and don't be afraid to share it with anyone who you think it can help. Let me know who you're pulling for in the comments below, and we'll start the grading with the newest addition to the Genshin cast, the Knave, Arlecchino. Arlecchino is an on-field pyro damage dealer who uses a bunch of random mechanics to make her normal attacks much stronger. I covered her kit in depth in my previous video discussing her value and playstyle compared to Neuvillette, so I'll only cover the basics of how she works here, otherwise this section could be quite long. If you do want to know more details about her, I'll have that video linked in the description, but here I'll give you an overview of the most important points. Arlecchino's playstyle involves using a slew of mechanics to enhance her normal attacks, giving them a big damage boost and also a pyro infusion. Arlecchino's skill deals AoE pyro damage and serves to apply a mark called Blood Debt to enemies. This mark deals pyro damage every few seconds, but what's important about it is it records how long it's been since it was first applied to the enemies, and Arlecchino can use a charged attack to absorb the marks from the enemies and create a bond of life. The longer the enemies are marked, the greater the bond of life she receives, but luckily you only have to wait a few seconds to get the maximum value from this ability. The Bond of Life prevents her from healing from everything but her burst, and it also gives her a big boost to normal attack damage and a pyro infusion when the Bond of Life is over 30% of her maximum HP. During this special state, Arlecchino not only receives that big boost to normal attack damage and the pyro infusion, but she also has increased resistances, and each normal attack will reduce her bond of life, while also slightly reducing the cooldown of her elemental skill. As you can tell, it takes Arlecchino a few steps to get to her enhanced normal attack state, unlike Wanderer, Hutel, Ayato, or Yoimiya, who simply have to use their skill to enter a similar enhanced normal attack state. You also have to manage Arlecchino's Bond of Life, because every normal attack she performs while in this enhanced state will reduce her Bond of Life, and you really want to keep it above 30% so she can keep her Pyro Infusion and normal attack damage bonus. Arlecchino's Elemental Burst deals AoE pyro damage, removes any remaining Bond of Life, and heals Arlecchino based on the amount of the Bond of Life removed, plus a percentage of her attack. And most importantly, it also resets Arlecchino's skill cooldown, allowing you to use her skill, mark enemies, absorb the mark with a charge attack, and then use her special normal attacks once again immediately after her elemental burst. The Bond of Life that she places on herself, and the fact that the only way to heal her in combat is by using her elemental burst, make Arlecchino a character that is very frail despite having increased resistances. This downside can be mitigated with shields, but that ends up being a sizable damage loss. Whether that's worth it or not is a personal preference, as some people may like playing Arlecchino for maximum damage, but with a higher risk factor of her being knocked out, and some people would prefer to do less damage, but have protection from damage and interruption that a shield provides. So how good is Arlecchino? Is she worth burning your primogems for, or is it better to remain fatherless for this harbinger? it's time to give Arlecchino a rating. Arlecchino's personal damage is good to great. Arlecchino has all the tools to be a great on-field damage dealer, but there's a high degree of variability for how she performs. She's a pretty frail character because of her mechanics, and she's also highly reliant on her supports for damage, and her highest damage potential will not use shield characters like Zhongli. Playing Arlecchino also requires managing her bond of life in her enhanced state and timing it with your rotations, so playing Arlecchino well takes more forethought and skill compared to many other characters in Genshin Impact. And because skill's only about half the equation with Arlecchino, and the other half is making sure you have the right characters and offensive supports for her, Arlecchino's damage will fluctuate quite a bit between players. If you have the support she wants, and take the time to learn her best rotations, then she'll do quite well. But if you don't have the support she wants, and just try to spam attacks with her, then she'll feel mediocre at best. Arlecchino's support capability is bad. She is an on-field damage dealer, and if she is not on the field dealing damage, then she does not contribute anything to the team. This is typical of many hypercarries because you have to build an entire team around them, and if they're not on the field, they just simply don't contribute anything to your team. Arlecchino's team flexibility is okay. She has several different teams that she does very well in, but they often require fairly specific supports, so they're not always the most flexible teams. For example, Arlecchino does quite well in a Chevreuse Overload team, but to play that team you only use Pyro or Electro characters, so that limits your choices quite a bit. However, she also does very well in a standard Vaporized team with Xingqiu or Yulan, Sucrose or Kazuha, and Bennett. And she also does pretty well in a normal attack hypercarry team with Yunjin, Bennett, and Zhongli for a little bit more comfort. However, characters like Farina are not a great choice for Arlecchino because the HP that her skill reduces, plus the bond of life that Arlecchino puts on herself and can't be healed by any means other than her burst, make Arlecchino super squishy with Farina. And the timing and consistency of Farina's Hydro application with Arlecchino are a lot more difficult for Vaporized setups compared to Yulan and Xingqiu. So while there are several different types of teams that Arlecchino can be used very well in, the characters in those teams are often very specific, and there's also certain characters that she just does not want to be paired with, so her team flexibility is just okay. Arlecchino's free-to-play friendliness is okay. She has decent free-to-play weapon choices, but really wants good supports and good teams to really show her potential. While her signature weapon is undoubtedly great for her, an R5 White Tassels, a 3-star spear, is just as good and even outperforms several gacha 4-star weapons, so she actually has a good free-to-play weapon option, but without proper support characters, she may look amazing in combat, but her damage might be a different story. So while she's very free-to-play friendly with regards to her weapon choice, her reliance on specific supports for specific team setups make her less free-to-play friendly. Arlecchino's overall rating is good. Arlecchino will be a solid character, and I feel like she is mostly an indicator of the strength of your account overall. What I mean is that she alone will not elevate your account to a god tier level, but if you have several highly in-demand support characters, then she immediately becomes a lot better. And if those support characters are well built, then she will feel even stronger. So if you can make a good Arlecchino team, like a Vaporized team with Bennett and Yulan or Xingqiu, and an overloaded team with Chevreuse and Fischl, Yaimiko, or Beidou, Arlecchino will scale very well as you build those supports. But if you don't have any good supports to make a cohesive Arlecchino team, then her damage will really suffer, and it's probably going to feel a lot more frustrating to play her than it is fun. For these reasons, I would not recommend Arlecchino for brand new players who likely don't have the support she really wants. And speaking of supports, recommended teammates for Arlecchino include Bennett, Xingqiu, Yulan, Kazuha, Sucrose, Chevreuse, Fischl, Beidou, Yaimiko, Yunjin, and Zhongli. Next is the magnificent magician and Cat in the Hat summoner, Lyney. Lyney is an on-field pyro damage dealer whose playstyle revolves around aiming charged attacks with his bow and yo-yoing his own HP up and down. A good way to think of Lyney is like Tanari mixed with Hu Tao. You're mainly dealing damage by using your special bow charge attacks, but you're also constantly reducing your own HP and then gaining some of it back to deal more damage. And if that sounds a little risky, it definitely is, but some people playing might find this high risk, high reward playstyle very appealing. It's also important to mention that Lyney is massively incentivized to play in a mono pyro team, because of a passive that increases his pyro damage by a ton when you have multiple pyro members in your team and you're attacking an enemy who is affected by pyro. So how good is Lyney? Is he an absolute beast even if he is a glass cannon, or do these magician's tricks fall short? Lyney's personal damage is good to great. He is an on-field pyro damage dealer with the potential of dealing tremendous damage, but you really have to work for it. Using aimed charge shots on bows is naturally harder than most other playstyles. Your field of vision is narrowed, allowing you to be hit by attacks much easier because you just don't see them coming as often, and your movement is also a bit limited, making it harder to dodge attacks while still firing. To top it all off, it can be a lot easier to miss charge shots altogether when fighting small enemies or enemies that jump all over the screen. And for these reasons, I want to note that Lyney's potential for damage is very high, but he does require a high degree of player skill in order to really maximize that damage. If you can solve all these problems while also lining up all your party buffs just right and then rapidly fire off his special charge shots, his damage potential is very high in single target. But if your timing isn't nearly perfect, or if you have to dodge attacks or the enemy is moving too much, then Lyney's damage potential will decrease dramatically. You could mitigate some of this trouble by bringing a strong shield character, but maximizing Lyney's damage will still require more skill than the average playstyle. Lyney's support capability is bad. He is an on-field DPS and doesn't benefit the team if he is not on-field dealing damage. He has the typical hypercarry syndrome, meaning that you have to build a team completely around him because he doesn't offer anything to the team if he's not blasting away on field. Lyney's team flexibility is bad. Lyney really wants to play in mono pyro teams, but he doesn't have to play in mono pyro team. Unlike a character like Nilou, who you have to play with only Hydro or Dendro characters if you want to use her unique mechanics, Lyney does not lose any unique mechanics if you play him in other types of teams, he just loses out on a ton of damage. That being said, he is likely going to be able to do much more damage in mono pyro than he can in a typical reaction team. So, if you want to maximize his potential, your team flexibility options are quite limited, and you'll probably see a lot of Lyney plus 2 other pyro characters and Sucrose, Kazuha, or Zhongli running around. Lyney's free-to-play friendliness is okay. He really wants at least 2 other pyro characters on his teams to maximize his damage. Everyone gets Xiangling for free, and she pairs very nicely with him, even if you do have to play a little bit up close and personal with her on the team. He also really wants Bennett, as the healing and attack buff are massive for Lyney, and he can also use C4 Yanfei as a shielder. Toma, however, is not a great choice because you have to use normal attacks to keep up the strong version of his shield. But you can also use Chevreuse and Bennett with Fischl or Yaimiko in an overloaded team with Lyney. This takes advantage of Lyney's passive to increase pyro damage, but it also may cause more problems. The overloaded reaction causes an explosion that knocks enemies away, making aiming your charge shots that much more difficult. This is definitely still a good team option, but it certainly does have its difficulties. He also has decent free-to-play weapon options like the Prototype Crescent or Song of Stillness, so it's often easier to get a good weapon for Lyney than it is to get him a great team. Lyney's overall grade is good. His personal damage is quite solid and he has some good free-to-play weapon options, but his playstyle, squishiness, and desire to play in a mono pyro team or in a Chevreuse overloaded team may turn some people off. Lyney requires a higher level of perception and awareness in combat compared to most other characters, so he may not be a great 5-star to play if you can't judge when an enemy that you can't see will attack you. However, you can play him with a shield, and that is a great solution even if it does reduce his damage potential. But hey, you can't fire your bow if an enemy is constantly knocking you out of your charge shots. Recommended teammates for Lyney include Bennett, Xiangling, Kazuha, Sucrose, C4 Yanfei for her shield, Dea, Chevreuse in an overloaded team with Fischl or Yaimiko, and Zhongli. The next 5-star on the list is a sojourning hat guy that everyone has garnered a lot of hype for in the past. It's the former 6th Fatui Harbinger and god wannabe Scaramouche, or as he's known now, Wanderer. Wanderer is an on-field animo DPS whose special mechanic involves channeling the powers of Zahir to float in the air and shoot wind blades at opponents. His skill puts him into a floating state, and in that state his normal attacks and charge attacks are enhanced, and he can use charge attacks without consuming any stamina. He does, however, consume Koguryoku points, which are basically just a floating meter that shows how long you can stay airborne. He can move freely in his floating state, but if he ascends or dashes, his airtime decreases much faster, as noted by his floating meter. Wanderer does have a passive talent that allows him to get a free dash and shoot some homing wind arrows when he performs a dash, but this free dash passive procs randomly, and it's therefore inconsistent, and shouldn't be relied on. His burst is just a big extra stomp of damage that is really satisfying to use, and has also awakened some odd feelings about wanting to be stepped on, at least according to many players' Twitter accounts. But there's a couple really important things to note about Wanderer. Number 1, his hurt box is deceptively large when he's floating. It extends all the way to the bottom of his feet, which just so happens to be the same height as a tall character. This means that Wanderer is actually a lot more vulnerable in the air than he seems, and that he will get hit by attacks that it looks like he can avoid. While you can ascend Wanderer upwards to avoid more attacks, that reduces your floating meter by a lot, and it also severely cuts down your damage window. The second important thing to know is that he has no interruption resistance while he's floating. So how does the angsty electro-turned-animo Hatboy stack up? And does he truly earn the nickname that I gave him? Let's give Scaramouche the Wanderer a rating. Wanderer's personal damage is good to great. He is a hyper carry, so that is to be expected, but what's not to be expected is how he achieves his damage. Wanderer needs a lot more investment than other hyper carries because he isn't relying on any reactions to amplify his damage. Instead, he's relying on very good artifacts, weapons, specific characters that can buff his animo damage, and attack speed. As the only real sources for buffing animo damage are Faruzan, and buffing attack speed are either Eula's signature weapon, the Song of Broken Pines, or Mika, he doesn't have access to a lot of the things he really wants. At least compared to a lot of other characters. Wanderer's support capability is bad. He is a typical hypercarry and thus has hypercarry syndrome. If he isn't on the field doing damage, then he is not contributing to the team since his entire kit is only meant to work on field and he doesn't provide any form of buff, sustain, or other advantage for teammates. Wanderer's team flexibility is good. Despite his best teams being quite niche, you can use Wanderer in pretty much any team that you would use Sucrose as a driver in, i.e. Vaporize, Freeze, Taser, and so forth. His personal damage is good, and running him with off-field damage dealers makes the team feel a lot better. Just note that you really don't want to build him with Elemental Mastery for swirl damage, you just want to build him with lots of attack and crit. He also has a unique problem in that some forms of off-field damage, particularly the types that follow your character like Kaya's Burst, will follow Wanderer as he floats, making them completely miss enemies unless the enemy is just massively tall. Wanderer's free-to-play friendliness is okay to good. He has a good free-to-play weapon option in the Flowing Purity, a Fontaine craftable catalyst, and he feels pretty good to play in the overworld. But he feels much stronger in the early and mid game than he does in the late game because he needs a lot more investment compared to other characters to really shine. This means you'll end up spending more resin and wishes for better artifacts, weapons, and teammates for him compared to other characters, especially because he really enjoys several supports with high constellations like C6 Faruzan. Wanderer's overall rating is good. His damage is good, and he's really fun to play in the overworld, but he feels quite bad in several domains and the Abyss if you don't have a shielder or a highly invested team setup. While his floating mechanic seems super fun and really unique, you soon realize that it's really not that special, and actually it causes more problems than it solves. If he had innate resistance to interruption, or the movement speed and range equivalent to Neuvillette while floating, he'd be so much better. But with his capabilities being what they are, he's still a solid damage dealer, just not the absolute best. Recommended teammates for Wanderer include Farazan, especially at C6, Bennett, Toma, Zhongli, Fischl, Beidou, Jingqiu, Yelan, Furina, Mika, and Layla. The next 5-star on the list is the good doctor who treats people's maladies even at the cost of his own health, Baizhu. Baizhu is a Dendro Catalyst user and healer. His skill sends out a serpentine spirit that hits enemies before returning to heal your whole team. His burst puts up a very weak shield that is meant to break, because when it does, it heals you, and then it refreshes a few seconds later, while every once in a while dealing Dendro damage to enemies close to you. Baizhu's skill heals a ton, and while his burst provides a shield that is pretty much only good for blocking one hit until it refreshes, so enemies that are super aggressive or attack multiple times over a few seconds can easily knock you around. Baizhu was always a pretty decent character, but he was often overshadowed by Yao Yao, a 4-star Dendro healer that is nearly as good as he is. So how does the sickly doctor fare these days? It's time to give Baizhu a rating. Baizhu's personal damage is bad. He has low range and low AoE potential, especially for a Catalyst character. His damage scales off of attack, but his heals scale off of HP, and his multipliers aren't high enough to justify building him to totally deal damage and sacrificing his healing capability. Baizhu's support capability is great. His healing is amazing and will be more useful with characters like Furina. His burst gives a little bit of interruption resistance as well, and while it's far from a perfect shield, it is plenty as long as you know when you have to dodge, unlike me who just face tanks everything. His passive talent also buffs Dendro reaction damage when he heals you, and while this is not a massive damage boost, it is still nice. Baizhu can further support the team with a Prototype Amber for more healing, a Favonius Codex for team energy, or a Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers to massively buff one character's attack, but normally you'll just stick to either the Prototype Amber or the Favonius Codex. Baizhu's team flexibility is great. As a Dendro character, Baizhu is welcome in a ton of different really powerful teams. Nilou Bloom teams, Aggravate or Spread teams, and Hyper Bloom teams all really appreciate Baizhu. Just note though that he is not great as a solo Dendro character like Nahida is, because his skill and burst don't apply enough Dendro consistently when he's alone, and you also don't get to use his skill that often in your rotations. But when paired with the Dendro Traveler and especially Nahida, his weaknesses become much less apparent. Baizhu can have very high energy recharge requirements, especially if he is the only Dendro character on a team, and we're talking upwards of 250% energy recharge or more in some cases. But you can solve these problems by using a second Dendro character in a team or giving him a Favonius Codex or High Refinement Prototype Amber, and if you do that, you can splash him into a lot of teams and make them feel super comfy. Baizhu's free-to-play friendliness is great, the Prototype Amber and Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers being easily accessible weapons for him, as well as many different team comps he can be in allow Baizhu to be a great free-to-play option for a ton of different players. But his damage capability is quite low, and he's not going to feel great for people who struggle to defeat enemies. But damage-dealing characters are quite common, and good healing characters are not, meaning that Baizhu can be valuable for those who want him for quite a long time. As long as people don't expect great damage and Dendro application from him, they'll find his medicine is anything but bitter. Baizhu's overall rating is good. He has ratings of great in several categories, but it's still hard to fully endorse Baizhu. He's always been a valuable character, but Yao Yao was often more than necessary for people who wanted a Dendro healer. Now Baizhu has become a character that has a lot more to offer, especially in teams with Furina, as his skill healing the whole team will charge Furina's fanfare stacks faster, and he's still just as valuable in the same teams as he always used to be, even if Yao Yao can often be a good substitute for him. I would personally recommend trying to get Yao Yao instead of Baizhu if you want a Dendro healer, but Baizhu is still a solid choice, and there's nothing wrong with wishing for him if you want him. Recommended teammates for Baizhu include Sino, Ayato, Nilou, Furina, Spread, Aggravate, or Hyperbloom teams, and pretty much any other team that wants a Dendro character and a healer. So now that the grading is complete, who should you wish for in patch 4.6? Well, my personal recommendation is not to wish and save your primogems this patch unless you really want one of these 5 stars. All of the 5 stars coming in patch 4.6 are pretty good, but none of them are without an alternative or replacement. There are plenty of on-field damage dealers that reach these same power levels as Arlecchino, Lyney, and Wanderer, and Baizhu can easily be replaced by Yao Yao. We also have not had Furina's rerun yet, and she would be a much greater benefit for most people's accounts. And if you're not in love with a character or just unsure about them, it's often best to wait and see who will be coming up in the next patch before you make a decision. That way you'll know if the current or upcoming 5 stars will be better for you. And if you don't know who would be best for you, you are welcome to come by my Twitch stream and get my personal recommendation. You can tell me who you want, who you have, and I can give you my recommendation on who would be best for you and your account. I stream daily in the mornings, Eastern Standard Time, and you can catch me live at twitch.tv/sharkheart, that's Shark H3ART. I hope this review has been helpful and clarified the value of certain characters for you. Please let me know which character you're going for, and don't be afraid to stop by on Twitch and ask me for my shark blessing. 50% of the time, it works 100% of the time. I love you, stay jawsome, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.